My name's Rachel, and I have a small business called Fields and Fire Company. Today, I'm going to be doing my first tutorial for how to do some low immersion acid dyeing of natural fiber yarn. So today, I have some yarn from Knomad. This is their Sandstone skeins. So Sandstone is primarily mulberry silk, 25% super kid mohair, 20% fine merino wool, and 4% viscose, which is not a natural fiber. So technically the viscose isn't going to dye, but at 4%, we're not really going to be able to notice that. It's fingering weight, very, very light. So I don't know if I can show you this, but here is a single strand. It's 2-ply. It's got kind of a nice halo. And then what's interesting about this yarn is it has some tweed in it. So it's got black and brown tweed pieces. Cool. So like I said, we're going to be using acid dyes today. Dharma Acid Dyes. You can see my dye collection here in the back. And I'm going to be following a recipe that I created, and I will be sharing with y'all exactly what I'm doing, so you should be able to recreate this at home if you want. Yeah, so thanks so much for tuning in, and we'll get right to it. Okay, so let's start with materials. So of course you're going to need your yarn, and these are just skeins as they come. I have 4 of them here. I've of course unraveled them. They come kind of looking like a cinnamon twist. And I have, while making sure not to tangle them, I have tied some just yarn, that this is technically macrame yarn, around the skein, and that's going to allow me to easily pick it up even while it is wet and potentially hot, which, you know, you can end up felting your yarn by doing that, so you want to be really gentle. This is also going to make sure it doesn't get all tangled while it's like in a bath of its own juices. Bath of its own juices. That was gross. Cool. So, of course, the yarn. You will need acid dye. So acid dye just means that it requires the dye bath to be acidic in order to dye your fiber. Sounds kind of scary, but it's really not. So I have some Dharma dye here, many colors. And I have already created some dye stock from my colors. So this is my Cabernet dye stock, and I have dyed little bits of yarn so I can remember what color it comes out at a specific depth of shade. You don't really need to know about that right now, but basically this way I don't have to mix my dye every time. And I'm not going to go into mixing up your dye stock in this video. There are lots of great videos that already exist on how to do that. But essentially you'll want to wear a mask because you don't want to breathe the dye powder. And you'll put the dye powder into a container that can handle very hot liquid. You'll want to measure it out with a kitchen scale in order to make a specific concentration. So this is 2% concentration. You'll need very hot water to do that. That's why I have this like coffee pourer here. And just as a reminder, anything that touches dye, it is a dye thing now, okay? So do not use stuff for this art process and then try to use it in your kitchen. Big no. Cool. Next up, you are going to need either citric acid or vinegar. So like I mentioned earlier, acid dye only works if the dye bath is acidic. So citric acid, pretty easy to acquire. And again, you'll need a scale to measure out the citric acid. You'll need something to put your skeins in, both while they are marinating in the citric acid, and something that they will be actually heated up in, because that's the other aspect of acid dye that is required to get it to work, is heat. So I just have these like stainless steel pans. I find that they fit just about 2 skeins in each of them, so very small dye operation here, very small dye line. You will need something to hold your dye stock in. I use these little milliliter marked cylinders. And then this isn't like totally necessary, but I highly recommend getting one or multiple of these technically disposable syringes. They don't have a needle. It's just for like uptaking significant, like up to 20 milliliters of a liquid. And I find this really helpful for getting very specific amounts of dye stock, and it doubles as a very precise dye applicator. So I can kind of like squirt this into the yarn and then squish it around, and so I can be very specific on where I'm putting the dye, if that's the look that you're going for. And last but not least, you will need a way to heat up your yarn. You can do this on the stove top of your actual kitchen. Just like I said, don't reuse anything that's touching the dye itself for kitchen purposes. What I actually do is I use a turkey roaster that I got at Goodwill for like 20 bucks. It's definitely kind of shitty, but you plug it into the wall. I usually turn it up to the dial to like 200 degrees, and I actually even just plug it in outside on my balcony because I don't like the way it smells. And I walk away, and then I come back in maybe 20 minutes or so, make sure the yarn's heated up, the dye is set, and then I let it cool back down. And I'll just show you, there is my turkey roaster right there. So have it inside so I can set it all up, and then I'll put it outside. You know, but again, it's only going to work for very small dye lot batches. Not going to be doing some kind of crazy operation with a turkey roaster. Okay, so first thing I'm going to do here is lay out my skeins. Pardon my cat. So generally I just do a little curve like that for each of my skeins. So like I said, they fit about 2 apiece in these little tins I have. And I try to make sure that the yarn is as flat in here as possible, because that's going to ensure that as much of the yarn as possible gets pigment on it. Okay, so now that I've done that, I am going to take this and go fill it up with water. 500 milliliters per 100 grams of fiber. So these skeins are 100 grams each, so I'm going to get 500 milliliters per skein. That's going to be 1,000 milliliters per tin. This is low immersion dyeing, so the goal is to have the water just barely up to the top of the yarn once the yarn has soaked up all the water it can. But before you pour the water in here, we are actually going to put the citric acid into the water and dissolve it. So don't get ahead of me just yet. Okay, so now we're going to measure out the citric acid for one of these pans. I have 1,000 milliliters of water over here to the side. The amount of citric acid per skein that we want is about 3 to 4% in grams to the weight of the fiber. So for a 100 gram skein, that's between 3 and 4 grams of citric acid. So for 2 skeins, we're going to want between 6 and 8 grams. So let's just do 7. I'll start by putting my scooper there and tearing it. 6.7. There we go. Perfect. So I will take this and mix that in with my water. And yes, I did put gloves on. You know, I wouldn't consider gloves a 100% necessary material as part of this process, but if you don't want mild, you know, I mean the equivalent of vinegar on your hands, or you don't want dye all over your hands, which is the bigger concern, then I would recommend getting yourself a pair of gloves. Okay, so we're just gonna mix that all up, make sure that is dissolved. Okay. And we're gonna pour it right into our tin. So one thing you'll notice about natural fibers, wool and silk in particular, they're kind of hydrophobic. So this process does involve a lot of massaging. And as you can see, you know, it doesn't really want to soak up the water, and honestly, this is just kind of a process. It's just a lot of squishing and trying to get that yarn to be agreeable. Remember, you don't want to agitate the yarn too much at any time while it is wet, because that is how you will end up felting your yarn. I promise you will be very disappointed if you go through all this process and then the yarn is not usable because it is felted together. Okay, so I have those skeins soaking, and different people will tell you different amounts of time that the skein should soak in the acid bath. You know, at a minimum 15 minutes to half an hour, but honestly, they can even be in there overnight. The key is you just want to make sure they're completely saturated. But in the meantime, I thought that we could talk a little bit about how to come up with your own dye recipes. Okay, so I've picked out 3 colors from my own dye stocks that I think would look nice together. That's Bright Aqua by Dharma, Baby Blue Eyes by Dharma, and then a color that I've created myself called Sandstone, which is mixed from Tangelo, Baby Blue, and Pecan Brown by Dharma. So these are 1% depth of shade. So what that means is for every 100 grams of fiber, I used 1 gram of dye powder. So we have a 100-gram skein here, and when I think about recipes, I talk about them in terms of per skein, 100 grams. So per skein, we're gonna need 1 gram of dye for a 1% depth of shade. So if you have already mixed up 1% dye stock solution, that would be equivalent to 100 milliliters of dye stock at 1%. But I mix my dye stock to 2% so that it's more concentrated. Basically means I don't need as much space to store it. So that equals 50 milliliters of dye stock at 2%. So yeah, this is some math involved here. So between these 3 colors, I want around 50 milliliters of dye for 1 skein. And you can always go more than that. It just means that you know, you're going to have a deeper or more intensely saturated color. So next thing I need to think about is what proportion of this skein do I want to be sandstone versus baby blue versus bright aqua. I think I would like the majority of it to be Sandstone and Baby Blue, and have Aqua be kind of an accent color because it is super bright. 40% Sandstone, 40% Baby Blue, that's 80% total, which would leave 20% for bright Aqua. So 0.4 or 40% of 50 milliliters. You're just going to multiply those numbers together. 0.4 times 50 milliliters, and then for the last color I'd have 0.2 times 50 milliliters. I am going to need my calculator to do that. But so we have Sandstone, Baby Blue, and Aqua. And then that will tell me how many milliliters of my 2% dye stock solution I need for each of these colors per skein. And then from there, you're really just going to be concerned about where are you pouring the dye. Ideally, your dye recipe should be repeatable, but of course, I think everyone knows that hand-dyed skeins are never going to come out exactly the same. The way I usually represent this in my recipes is by literally drawing out how I would have laid out the skeins, and this is by no means very scientific, but I find it helpful. So these are like my 2 skeins in my tin, and then I can kind of draw on here where I would be pouring my dye. So if I want it to be like completely random, then this is a little less valuable. But for instance, I could say, okay, I want there to be a larger chunk here that is sandstone, and that's going to be continuous, with spots of the aqua next to the sandstone, and then baby blue down here. That's an example. But it's important to note that there will be more chunks of baby blue in the yarn when it knits up than the sandstone. The sandstone will be like larger continuous splotches when knitted up, and then the aqua and baby blue would be kind of chunked up more in the final piece. You could also think about pouring your dye diagonally like this. Again, that's a little more random. So yeah, it's really up to you. And this is what I'll be doing here in the next part of the video when I pour my dye. Okay, so these babies have been soaking for about an hour, and I've sort of pushed down any spots that looked like they still weren't totally wet. Fun fact, you may now be thinking, what's that smell? Well, if your yarn has any wool in it, when it gets wet, it's going to have, for lack of a better word, kind of a barn smell to it. And that is the lanolin, which is a naturally occurring oil on sheep. And so the more lanolin that's in the yarn, the stronger that smell is going to be. It's not bad for you in any way. And once the yarn totally dries out, you really won't smell that anymore. But yeah, don't be alarmed if suddenly your room kind of smells like a farm. I like the smell, but I understand not everyone does. My husband and our roommate definitely don't. Okay, so I have poured out my dye quantities here, and as we went over in the previous section, I wrote up my recipe per skein. I have 4 skeins here, so I quadrupled the milliliters. And I will include a recipe for this sandstone color in the description, which is made up of Dharma colors, but to a specific ratio. Cool. So I'm gonna take my handy dandy syringe tool here. And I have just kind of a bucket of water to the side, and my reasoning for that is so that I can really thoroughly clean out my syringe when I'm going between colors. So first up, I am going to apply the sandstone. And we talked a little bit about this in the recipe section, but I think I'm just gonna kind of go for a somewhat random application for these. I think it'll look nice if it's just really just mottled, rather than having chunks of the yarn in different colors. And I think that this brown and the blues are gonna mix nicely together in those areas where they are touching. So I'll start with sandstone, and I have 80 milliliters of sandstone here because I need 20 per skein. So I will take up my first 20, and I am just going to apply this to one skein at a time. Squishy squish there. Okay, clean out my syringe, wash my gloves a little bit. It helps to have a rag nearby as well, to make sure you get all that dye off your gloved fingers. Okay, next up I'm gonna do the baby blue eyes. So again, I have 80 milliliters of the baby blue eyes measured out here. And I'm kind of just going to aim for the areas that I didn't hit with the sandstone. These dye solutions are also, you know, they're a little older than maybe I'd like them to be. They don't really go bad per se, but the color can change on you. So, like for instance, this baby blue is going on a lot darker than I would have expected it to, given my like test piece of yarn that I showed you guys earlier. That being said, you know, after the dye has struck to the yarn and you've washed it and everything, it can end up looking different than it does at this stage. Lastly, I have this aqua color. It's going to provide some brighter spots to the yarn. And this is 10 milliliters per skein. Oh, yeah, see how that has not penetrated all the way? Yeah. So we are gonna have to squish these a little bit, which is kind of worrying because that could mean that the other side of the skein gets really muddy. So if I split this here, oh yeah, okay, I'm a little concerned that I didn't let this yarn soak long enough, and that's why we're seeing these white areas. That being said, the heat will also help set this dye a little more. So now I'm going to put these in my turkey roaster. My turkey roaster is really only big enough for two of these pans. And I use the little wire rack that it came with to stack one on top of the other. Like I mentioned earlier, these, you don't want to get these up to boiling, okay? That's another way you can felt the yarn pretty easily. So instead, I'd recommend trying to stay around 200 degrees, maybe even a little lower. And I will let these get up to temp, let them heat, simmer, if you will, for probably 20 minutes, and then I'll let them cool back down. And we will check back in once the dye is set. We'll see whether or not we end up having to flip these and do this again. It really is just going to depend on what they look like on the other side, and I don't want to pick them up and flip them right now, because that will result in a really muddy color. Okay, so I'm back, and these guys have heated up and cooled back off, and they're not totally cool yet, so I don't want to agitate them very much, but as you can probably see here, we do have quite a bit of white left. So, you know, the reason that that happened is that these skeins can't sit super flat in these tins when I put 2 of them in there. And I completely forgot to actually inject the dye down into the skein. All I did was kind of pour it like this, and I should have been more intentional about kind of squirting it inside. Basically what that's going to result in is white spots, obviously, and the parts that are dyed are going to be much darker than my swatches, because essentially they took up a lot more dye powder than I intended them to. So I'm gonna flip this over and kind of see how bad it is here. I have a couple options now. Basically, I can keep the white spots and try and say it was intentional, or I can apply more dye and heat them back up. So kind of trying to decide what I want to do there. This could be an opportunity to add another color as well. Another thing I'll point out is on one of these, I was really good about carrying it outside super steadily and not mixing the dye bath up very much. And then the other one, I was dumb and definitely let it kind of slosh around a lot more than I should have. And basically that meant that the underside got kind of muddy. Can you guess which one I did that to? It's this one. So this one has a lot more white spots because I didn't slosh it around too much like that. So I think I am going to put another color in there to try and cover up some more of this white. And I think maybe I'm gonna do a green. I have a sage green, an emerald, and a pistachio green. I think I'm gonna go for like the sage leaf green would look nice with the browns. Okie dokie. I have poured out 15 milliliters of sage green per tin here, and then I've watered it down with another 30 milliliters of water. So here is my swatch for my sage leaf, which I think will fill out those white areas nicely. It'll probably be a little lighter than that because I've diluted it, and I'm not gonna lie, y'all, at this point I am certainly winging it a little more than I intended to. But I think it's important for tutorials and like how-to videos to talk about problem solving, and, you know, figuring out what to do when things don't go exactly how you'd like them to, and not resort to just scrapping everything. So that's what I'm trying to do. Show you guys just how to problem solve and get past challenges. So I have 20 milliliters of my sage green here. Just gonna start, and because this is the only color in this dye bath at this point, the water's totally clear because I've heated it up already, and so the color has struck and all the pigment has been taken up. So I'm really not worried about squishing this in too much because there's no other colors for it to blend and get all muddy with. Okay, so I ended up using that whole 30 milliliters of dye for just one tin. So I'm gonna grab it again here. And I'll do the other tin off camera. I think you get the point at this point. And I will bring the tins back up to 200 degrees and let it set once again, and then we can wash them. Okay, it is the next morning. I got lazy last night and did not want to wash these. It was like 10 and I really didn't want to do it. So I left them in their dye bath overnight. That's okay because all of the pigment, I don't know if you can see this, but this is just clear water. All the pigment's been taken up by the yarn. It's totally exhausted. So one thing I did do off camera is I added in some emerald because I flipped them one more time and there were still white spots, like right here. Here's one I totally missed. That's just gonna have to be part of the yarn. So I added in some emerald on this other side. I think it's gonna look nice, but we won't really know what it looks like until we have it washed and dried. So to wash my yarn, generally what I do is pick them up by the handle. Again, I use macrame cord. A lot of people use reusable zip ties. Very gently squeeze some of the excess water out there. And then I have a plastic tub, pretty easy, that I'm just gonna put these 4 skeins in. So I'm gonna take this guy to my sink in my laundry room and fill her up with some water and soap. And I will show you guys the finished product. Hello! Okay, so the yarn is dry and ready to show off. So look at the final result. So here's all 4 skeins together, untwisted. And something that I find, I don't know, maybe it's just because I'm harsh on my own work, but before I have them twisted into the little cinnamon twists, I always think they look worse. And then I twist them up and then I'm like, oh no, that looks pretty cool. So, you know, one thing that's important to me when I craft is to actually look at the finished product and kind of do like a debrief. So thinking about what we could have done better, what maybe I would have done differently. Throughout this video, I've already discussed that I didn't inject the dye deeply enough, consistently enough, and so for that reason, we definitely have a very, I don't want to say splotchy because it's such a negative term, but like a small bursts of color. And there are definitely still a couple areas that are a little more on the white side than I would like, but I think that they are, for the most part, a very light sage green, like here. So yeah, definitely would have been better about injecting the dye. Probably would have diluted it more when I applied it because it did strike so fast. I mean, this is the baby blue and that looks nothing like my my dye stock example that I have. Anyway, so I will twist these up, and we can see what they look like then. Here they are, all twisted up, and I don't know, man. You guys have to let me know if this is just me, but I really think the yarns just look so much better when they are rolled up like this. I wonder if it's something about the colors kind of like being more alongside each other because they're folded in half. But yeah, now that these are, you know, all twisted up, I think these look really nice. Probably would still go for slightly less saturated coloration if I was going to do this again. But one of the most fun parts about dyeing yarn is coming up with a name for the colorway, which is another word for the dye recipe. What would y'all call this? You know, first thing that pops in my mind is like psychedelic autumn or something. But yeah, would love to hear your suggestions. And I hope you found this video useful. Again, please post any questions that you have in the comments, and I will respond as soon as I can. And if you appreciated the video, please do a like and a subscribe and all that good stuff. Okay, thanks. Bye.